Chapter 1. The city never slept. Streetlights cast eerie shadows across the pavement while cars rushed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the small figure moving along the grimy sidewalk. To the hurried pedestrians, Emma didn't exist. She was simply another shadow, a wisp easily overlooked and instantly forgotten. Emma didn't mind being invisible. At 8 years old, she'd learned that invisibility had its advantages. The evening sky still held the last traces of sunset when she arrived at the alley behind Romano's restaurant. Tuesday was her favorite day here. The chef with the bushy mustache often tossed out perfectly good food, sometimes whole slices of pizza or bread that had barely been touched. Lucky day, Emma whispered, discovering half a lasagna still warm in its container. The scent made her stomach rumble so loudly she couldn't help but laugh, a small pleasure in a world of large struggles. She tucked the precious find inside her oversized coat and continued searching, careful not to take everything at once. Better to spread out resources, just in case. Emma had taught herself this survival tactic, along with countless others that kept her alive on the streets. While rummaging through a nearby bin, her fingers closed around something round and smooth, a metallic blue bottle cap. Emma slipped it into her pocket alongside others she'd collected that week. Ordinary trash to most, but treasure to her. The wind tousled her blonde hair as heavy clouds rolled in. Emma recognized the signs of approaching rain and quickened her pace. Cold and rain weren't strangers to her. Her small body had adapted to the elements during her years on the streets. The coat she wore, 3 sizes too big and found in a church donation box, bore faded stains but provided necessary warmth. Emma headed for the abandoned subway station. During renovations, workers had left equipment boxes in the east entrance corner. She'd discovered that by stacking 2 of them in a particular way, they formed a perfect rain shelter. In her hidden sanctuary, Emma maintained her small world, a realm of bottle caps arranged in intricate patterns. Each color represented a kingdom in the imaginary map she'd created. Crushed cans became buildings, pieces of colored glass transformed into lakes and oceans. It was a domain where she ruled, where no one could evict her or pretend she didn't exist. The first raindrops fell as she rounded the corner to the station, thick and heavy, making loud splashes against the asphalt. Emma ran, feeling the rare joy of freedom that running brought. It was one of the few things she truly enjoyed. City lights began to illuminate puddles forming on the streets. The world looked different when it rained, cleaner somehow, brighter, as if the water washed away the grime and sadness, if only temporarily. Going to be a big one, she thought, observing the lightning that signaled a strengthening storm. She reached the station just as the rain unleashed its full force. Her blonde hair plastered against her pale face, and her soaked sneakers squeaked with each step. It didn't matter. In a few minutes, she'd be dry enough inside her shelter. Emma rearranged the boxes to prevent water from seeping in, then took out the lasagna and began eating slowly, savoring each bite as if it were her last meal. Food was one of the few genuine pleasures she still enjoyed, perhaps because she never knew when the next meal would come. As she ate, she thought about what it would be like to have a real home, a roof that didn't leak, a bed that wasn't made of cardboard, food that didn't come from dumpsters. Sometimes, passing buildings with large windows, she would glimpse families sitting around tables, laughing and talking together. Emma had no memories of a father. Her mother existed only as a hazy figure, cheap perfume, cold hands, broken promises. "I'll be right back, honey. Wait here." Those were the last words Emma had heard from her, so long ago it sometimes felt like a dream from another life. She'd waited for hours, then days. When hunger drove her forward, she began searching for food. When police appeared, she learned to hide. Gradually, the streets became her home. The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the station in brief, harsh flashes followed by thunder that made the ground vibrate. Emma wasn't afraid. There were far worse things than storms. People, for instance. She finished the lasagna and wiped her hands on her coat. Then she took the caps from her pocket and began arranging them. Lost in her fantasy world, the only place where she truly existed, where she mattered. There, she wasn't just a shadow but a queen, a builder of cities, a person. Rain fell in dense curtains, hitting the metal and concrete around her. The sound created a comforting white noise that muffled the city's constant rumble. Emma lay down on her makeshift mattress of cardboard and fabric scraps and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring another day of searching for food and treasures. She was almost asleep when she heard it, the screech of tires on wet pavement, loud enough to cut through the storm's roar. Then came the metallic crash of something colliding violently with a fixed object. Emma sat up immediately. Accidents meant confusion, police, questions, situations that required even deeper hiding. But they also meant someone might need help. She hesitated. The rain pounded heavily, and her shelter remained dry. It wasn't her problem. The outside world didn't care about her, so why should she care about it? Yet something prompted her to move. Perhaps curiosity, or maybe that stubborn part of her that still believed people could be good, despite all evidence to the contrary. Cautiously, she left her shelter, staying in the shadows. The rain came down in sheets, but visibility had improved enough to see what had happened. A large black luxury car had crashed into a streetlight. The front end was completely destroyed, and small flames were beginning to appear beneath the hood, dancing even through the heavy rain. Emma scanned the street. It was eerily empty, as if this corner of the city had been forgotten by the storm, by fate itself. She crept closer, still hidden in darkness. That's when she saw him, the driver, trapped in the front seat, moving weakly. The door appeared smashed, impossible to open. The flames grew larger, fed by something leaking from the ruined engine. Emma hesitated again. Helping meant being seen. Being seen meant questions, possibly authorities, maybe one of those places meant for kids like her, the shelters and foster homes she feared. Then she heard the shout, a cry of pure desperation that cut through the rainy night. "Please don't let me die here." The man's voice contained a vulnerability Emma recognized too well. It wasn't the cry of someone important or powerful, but of someone who, at that moment, was just as alone and helpless as she often felt. Emma took a step back, ready to return to her hideout. It wasn't her problem. It couldn't be. Surviving on her own was difficult enough. "Somebody help me, please." His voice was weaker now, muffled by the smoke beginning to fill the car. The flames suddenly flared, illuminating the vehicle's interior. Emma saw the man's face clearly, wide eyes filled with terror, blood running down his forehead. He didn't look powerful or threatening, just scared. Not so different from her own face in her nightmares. In that moment, Emma made a decision that would transform her life forever. Chapter 2. Emma ran toward the burning car. Rain pounded her face as she approached, the heat from the growing flames creating a stifling pocket of air around the vehicle. The man saw the small figure approaching and looked confused, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "The door's stuck," he managed to say between coughs as smoke filled the car. Emma tried to open it, but it was too heavy and badly dented from the impact. She pulled with all her might, her feet slipping on the wet asphalt, but the door wouldn't budge. "It's going to blow," the man muttered, fear evident in his voice. "Run, kid. Save yourself." But Emma didn't run. She looked around desperately and spotted a medium-sized rock in a nearby planter. Grabbing it with both hands, she shouted, "Turn your face away." The man obeyed instinctively. With all the strength her small body could muster, Emma slammed the rock against the passenger window. Once, twice. On the third try, the glass shattered, disintegrating into thousands of tiny fragments. The heat had intensified to an almost unbearable level. Emma shielded her face with her arm as she reached through the broken window to the man's seatbelt. Her small fingers worked quickly at the latch. "Can you move?" she asked, coughing in the thickening smoke. The man nodded weakly, dragging himself toward the broken window. Emma helped as best she could, pulling him by the arms. He was heavy and much larger than she was, but adrenaline gave her unexpected strength. "Come on," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You can do it." With one final effort, they succeeded. The man tumbled out of the car onto the wet sidewalk. Emma pulled him farther away, her small hands gripping the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "Farther," she mumbled, hearing the ominous sound of fire reaching the fuel tank. They crawled a few more feet from the crash site. The man coughed violently but was breathing. He was alive, because of her. The car exploded behind them, not like in movies with a massive fireball, but with a series of pops and larger flames that completely engulfed the vehicle. Even from a distance, Emma felt the heat against her back. The man lay on the sidewalk gasping for air. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, mixing with rainwater that washed over his face. His eyes, however, remained focused on Emma. "You," he began, his voice weak but clear. "You saved me." Emma didn't answer. She was already regretting having helped. People meant complications, questions, having to explain things she preferred to hide. "What's your name?" the man asked, fighting to remain conscious. She hesitated. Giving her name was dangerous. A name meant identity, identity meant being found, and being found was the last thing she wanted. But something in the man's eyes made her answer. Not the pitying look some adults gave when they saw her rummaging through trash, nor disgust or fear, but genuine gratitude. "Emma," she finally replied, her voice almost a whisper amid the rain and flames. The man managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Emma," he said before his eyes began to close, consciousness slipping away. In the distance, sirens approached. Someone had finally noticed the crash and called for help. The sounds grew louder, cutting through the night like sharp knives. Emma looked at the unconscious man, then at the red and blue lights appearing at the far end of the street. She had done enough. Soon, she'd be surrounded by police, paramedics, people asking questions she didn't want to answer. "Goodbye," she murmured, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The sirens drew closer. Emma took one last look at the man. His black suit was torn and dirty, but still signaled wealth. He would be fine. People like him were always fine. They had money, power, people who cared. By the time the first ambulance turned the corner, Emma had vanished into the shadows, invisible again as she'd always been. The only evidence of her existence were the small, wet footprints that would soon be washed away by the rain. The paramedics found only an unconscious man beside a burning car. As they carried him to the ambulance, checking his vital signs and administering first aid, no one noticed the small figure watching from afar, cloaked in the darkness of a nearby alley. Emma watched as they loaded the man into the ambulance. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like to go with him to a clean, warm hospital, maybe receive an official thank you, possibly even a reward, a place to stay. But she knew it wouldn't happen that way. There would be questions, then social services, then she'd just be another lost kid in the system, another statistic. Better to stay invisible. The ambulance departed, taking the man to a world Emma only observed from a distance, a world of comfort, security, and certainty she could barely imagine. The sirens faded, leaving only the sound of rain and the distant crackling of the burning car. Emma returned to her shelter, soaked and exhausted. The adrenaline rush had worn off, leaving her trembling and cold. She lay down on her damp cardboard mattress, pulling a piece of cardboard over herself like a blanket. She closed her eyes, listening to the storm outside. No one ever noticed Emma. That was how she survived. But this time someone had seen her. Someone knew her name. And that would change everything. Chapter 3. Jackson Hayes opened his eyes slowly. The bright white ceiling light made his head throb. The smell of disinfectant and steady beeping of machines confirmed his location, a hospital room. He tried to move, but pain stopped him. His body felt broken in places he hadn't known existed. His right arm was bandaged, and he could feel gauze wrapped around his chest and head. He closed his eyes again, attempting to organize the fragmented memories drifting through his mind. The car, the rain, the streetlight, the fire, and then to her. "Emma," he whispered, his first coherent thought since waking. A nurse checking his vitals paused and leaned over him. "Mr. Hayes, you're awake. I'll call the doctor immediately." Jackson barely acknowledged her. His mind fixated on the memory of that small figure in the rain, wet hair plastered to her face, large serious eyes that seemed far older than they should be, tiny hands dragging him away from the burning car. "Emma," he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. The doctor arrived, followed by 2 assistants. Over the next few minutes, Jackson endured questions about how he felt, tests of his responsiveness, and explanations about his injuries. 3 broken ribs, a mild concussion, second-degree burns on his right arm, cuts and bruises covering his body. "You're very lucky, Mr. Hayes," the doctor finally said. Another minute in that car and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Jackson nodded slightly, his gaze distant. Who found me? He asked, though he already knew the answer. He needed confirmation that he hadn't imagined the girl. The doctor exchanged confused looks with the nurse. According to the paramedics, you were alone when they arrived. Someone must have called 911, but they didn't stay at the scene. Jackson closed his eyes again. So she had simply disappeared, melting back into whatever shadows she'd come from. A child on the streets, out in the storm, after saving his life. I need to make a call, he said, attempting to sit up. Mr. Hayes, you need to rest. Anything business-related can wait. Jackson's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Now. The doctor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Just a few minutes. Once alone, Jackson reached for the phone and dialed a number few people knew. Mercer, he said when the call connected. I need you. 3 days passed before Jackson had the strength to leave his bed for more than a few minutes. The doctors insisted he stay in the hospital for at least another week, but he knew his own body. More importantly, he knew his mind, and his mind couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Emma. The girl who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously, leaving only her name and a debt Jackson didn't know how to repay. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Daniel Mercer walked into the hospital room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, the ex-military man carried a discreet folder under his arm. His usually impassive face showed a slight frown upon seeing his employer's condition. You look awful, Mercer said, sitting in the chair next to the bed. Always honest, Jackson replied with a faint smile. What did you find out? Mercer placed the folder on the bedside table and opened it, revealing photos and documents. Nothing good, he began, his tone professional. The crash wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with your car's brakes. Jackson nodded slowly. Somehow he'd expected that. There's more, Mercer continued, showing an enlarged photo of the car's door mechanism. The locks were modified. At the moment of impact, they jammed automatically. Whoever did this didn't just want you to crash. They wanted to make sure you were trapped inside when the fire started. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. If not for Emma, he would have burned alive, unable to escape. Suspects. Mercer pulled another photo from the folder, a middle-aged man with carefully combed hair and an impeccable suit. Theodore Wells, your former partner, has plenty of motive. After you forced him out of the company last year over that embezzlement scandal, he publicly swore you'd regret it. Jackson took the photo, studying the face of the man he'd considered a friend for almost a decade. Even after the theft, even after the threats, he never imagined Theodore would go this far. Do we have solid proof? We're getting there. I found out he hired a mechanic with a criminal past. We're tracing the payments. Jackson handed the photo back, his gaze drifting to the hospital window, looking out at the city below. Keep investigating, he said finally. But keep it all quiet for now. Mercer frowned, puzzled. You don't want to hand him over to the police? Not yet. I have another priority at the moment. Jackson turned to Mercer, his gaze suddenly intense. I need you to find someone. A girl named Emma, a street kid, probably 7 or 8 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes. She pulled me out of the car before it exploded. Mercer remained silent for a moment, absorbing the information. A street kid saved you? She broke the window with a rock. Dragged me out. Jackson touched his bandaged chest unconsciously, as if her name were inscribed there. I need to find her, Daniel. The city's huge, Jackson. Thousands of homeless people, many of them children. It could be like looking for a needle in a haystack. You've found harder things before. Mercer nodded slowly. I'll need a more detailed description, anything that might help. Jackson closed his eyes, trying to recall every detail of that rainy night. She was alone. Wore old clothes, way too big. Seemed adapted to street life. She wasn't scared, even with the fire. So determined. He paused, remembering her small voice. She didn't say much, but when she told me her name, it sounded like she was revealing a secret. Mercer jotted down notes in a small notebook. I'll start today, he said, getting up. But Jackson, the city isn't kind to homeless children. If we find her, What do you plan to do? Jackson looked at his own hands, the scratches and cuts still healing, hands that would be cold and lifeless if not for a girl the world had forgotten. Help her, he answered simply. In whatever way she needs. Mercer nodded and left the room, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. Outside, the city continued its frenetic rhythm, thousands of lives following their paths without ever intersecting. Somewhere among the tall buildings and dark alleys, a girl named Emma remained invisible to everyone. But not to Jackson Hayes. To him, she was the most important person in the world. Chapter 4. 3 days had passed since the stormy night. Emma continued her routine on the streets as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't saved a man's life, as if the name Emma hadn't escaped her lips and entered the world of the visible. Life in the shadows went on. That morning, the sky was clear with no sign of the storm that had drenched the city days before. Emma woke early, as she always did. Sleeping too long meant missing the best chances to find food, moments when bakeries threw out yesterday's bread or when grocery stores separated slightly bruised fruit. Her stomach growled as she walked along the sidewalk, staying close to building walls. Years on the streets had taught her the art of being invisible, not just hiding, but moving in such a way that people's eyes simply slid past her as if she were just another piece of urban scenery. Good morning, young lady. Emma froze at the sound of the voice. It was the man from the corner newsstand, an older gentleman with white hair who always greeted her. He was one of the few people who actually saw her. Want an apple? It's left over from my lunch. She hesitated, then cautiously approached. She took the fruit with a quick motion without speaking. You're welcome, the man said with a gentle smile, already accustomed to the girl's silence. Emma bit into the apple as she walked away. It was sweet and crisp, a rare luxury. Usually, the fruit she found was overripe or bruised. As she ate, her eyes landed on the newspapers displayed at the stand. Normally, she paid them no mind. News belonged to the world of the visible, not hers. But today, something caught her eye, a headline in bold letters, Billionaire escapes death in mysterious accident. Below was a photograph of the destroyed car she knew all too well. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Billionaire. The man she'd saved was rich. Very rich. She shouldn't have been surprised. The car was expensive, the clothes too. But somehow, when she saw him trapped in the wreckage, screaming for help, he had just seemed human. Scared and vulnerable, like anyone else. Emma went on her way, pensive. What would a billionaire do now? Probably go back to his mansion and forget about the accident entirely. Forget about the little figure who saved him in the rain. Rich people didn't care about someone like her, that Emma had learned by watching the city for years. The day passed like so many others. She searched dumpsters behind restaurants, found a few coins near a bank, played with her colorful caps when no one was watching. Her little kingdom grew every time she found a new treasure. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to set, Emma decided to pass through Central Park. She normally avoided crowded places, but sometimes people dropped leftover food there. Bits of sandwiches, fries, half-melted ice cream. The park was busier than usual. Several people stood still, staring at the giant screen that occasionally displayed news and commercials. Emma stayed off to the side, partially hidden behind a trash can. That's when she saw him on the huge screen. The face of the man she had saved filled the entire display. He was no longer covered in blood and grime. He was clean, with neatly styled brown hair, wearing a dark suit that looked more expensive than anything Emma had ever seen. A small bandage on his forehead was the only visible sign of the accident. A name appeared in white letters at the bottom of the screen. Jackson Hayes, CEO of Hayes Industries. Emma stood frozen. It was strange to see that face again, now so composed and in control, so different from the terrified man who had begged not to die. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, nothing like the desperate screams from the night of the storm. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who showed concern after my accident. The doctors assure me I will make a full recovery. Emma watched, fascinated by the transformation. It was like two different people. But there's something more important I need to say. The man Jackson Hayes paused. His gaze seemed to change, becoming more intense, more personal, as if he was no longer speaking to a room full of reporters but to a single person. On the night of the accident, when I was trapped in the burning car, Someone appeared out of nowhere and saved my life. A child. A little girl. Emma felt her heart race. He was talking about her. I don't know where she came from or where she went. All I know is her name. The girl shrank further behind the trash can, as if the people in the park might somehow connect her to the words on the screen. Emma, said Jackson Hayes, and something in his voice made her tremble. Wherever you are, thank you for saving me. There was no sound from the crowd in the park. Everyone watched in silence, likely intrigued by the story of a powerful businessman saved by an anonymous child. If anyone knows who this little girl is, please contact my office. I want to thank her personally. I want to help her in whatever way she needs. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. Help her. That was what people always said before disappearing. Or worse, before sending her to places where people in white coats asked endless questions. Empty promises, she whispered, eyes still fixed on the screen. I won't rest until I find her, Hayes continued. I owe her my life. Emma almost laughed. A man like that, worried about a street kid? Impossible. He'd soon forget, too busy counting money and driving fancy cars. She started to walk away, ready to return to the shadows that sheltered her, when something made her stop. It wasn't his words, but something in his eyes. On the giant screen, the camera had zoomed in on Jackson Hayes' face, and there was something there Emma recognized, something that surprised her. It wasn't pity or superficial charity, not even just gratitude. It was truth. His eyes, blue and clear on the digital screen, had the same intensity Emma had seen that night when he'd asked her name before passing out, as if even amid pain and danger, he truly wanted to know who she was. Emma stood there, torn between the instinct to flee and a reluctant curiosity that began to grow inside her. On the screen, Hayes continued speaking, now about donations to charities that helped homeless children, but Emma was no longer listening to his words. She was studying the man himself. She'd seen many adults in her short life, cruelty, indifference, occasional shallow kindness. She recognized masks and lies the way others recognize familiar faces. But that man's eyes, Jackson Hayes's, were different, as if he too knew what it felt like to be invisible. Lies, she muttered, turning her back on the screen and walking away from the park. But as she slipped back into the city's shadows, Emma couldn't forget those eyes, that look. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe not. Emma had survived by learning to doubt, and she would keep doubting. It was safer that way. But for the first time in a long while, a small and dangerous feeling bloomed inside her. Hope. Chapter 5. Jackson Hayes gazed out of the hospital window, looking at the city sprawling below. He was in a private room on the 10th floor with a view of the skyscrapers he knew so well. Somewhere among those buildings and streets was a girl named Emma. The girl who had saved his life, then vanished like smoke. Any word from Mercer? He asked, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. As if on cue, the door opened and Christine, his personal assistant, rushed in. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, but I couldn't locate Mr. Mercer. He's not answering his cell or returning messages. Jackson frowned. It wasn't like Mercer to be unreachable. Keep trying, he said, turning back to the window. And when are the doctors bringing my discharge papers? Soon, sir. They still think you should stay a few more days. Jackson shook his head. He didn't have time for that, not when he needed to find Emma. The door opened again, and this time it was Daniel Mercer himself who entered the room. Tall with salt and pepper hair, his face lined from years of experience, the ex-FBI officer and now Jackson's head of security wore a serious expression. Where were you? Jackson asked bluntly. Working, Mercer replied simply. He glanced at Christine. Could you give us a moment? The assistant left, closing the door quietly behind her. Mercer approached the hospital bed. How are you feeling? Tired of lying down. I need to get out of here, Daniel. I need to find her. The girl. Emma. Jackson confirmed with a nod. She saved my life, risked her own for a total stranger, and now she's out there alone. Mercer studied his boss carefully. He'd known Jackson Hayes for 15 years, ever since saving him from a kidnapping attempt in Colombia. In that time, he'd watched the young businessman become one of the richest and most powerful men in the country. But he'd never seen him so affected by something or someone. What exactly do you want me to do? he asked, though he already knew the answer. Jackson took something from the bedside table, a metallic blue bottle cap. Find her. Use any resources you need. She's small, blonde hair, probably around 7 or 8 years old. She was alone the night of the accident. This cap fell out of her pocket when she dragged me from the car. Mercer picked up the small metal piece, examining it closely. A street kid, he said, more to himself than to Jackson. I need to find her, Daniel. I owe her my life. The investigator tucked the cap into his pocket. I'll start immediately. I'll need details. Everything you remember about her, about the exact location of the accident. Jackson nodded and, for a few minutes, described what little he could recall from that stormy night, the small figure appearing in the darkness, the rock breaking the window, the tiny hands pulling him away from the flames. Find her, he repeated as Mercer headed for the door. No matter how long it takes. 3 days passed since Mercer began his search. The city was vast, with thousands living on the streets, many of them children. Finding one specific girl was indeed like looking for a needle in a haystack, but Mercer thrived on challenges. He started exactly where Jackson had told him, the crash site. The marks were still visible, bits of glass on the sidewalk, tire tracks on the asphalt, the bent streetlight. Nearby was an old subway station, closed for renovations. Mercer knew the streets well and, more importantly, knew the people who truly saw what went on there. He began casting his net, a series of seemingly casual conversations with those most people ignored. I'm looking for a small girl, blonde hair. She lives around here, he explained to the owner of a nearby newsstand. The man scratched his beard, thinking. There is a girl who comes by sometimes. She never talks, but she always looks at the newspapers from a distance, like she wants to read the headlines. Does she collect anything? Bottle caps, maybe? Mercer asked discreetly, showing the blue cap. Now that you mention it, yes. She picks up any caps customers drop. Always really quiet, that kid. It was a start. Mercer continued investigating, talking to local shopkeepers, doormen, custodians, invisible people who saw far more than one might think. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Several merchants in the area mentioned the same child, a quiet girl who showed up regularly, always alone, often collecting small items others considered trash. She comes here every Tuesday and Thursday, said an employee at a local diner. She never asks for anything, but sometimes I leave a sandwich accidentally outside when I see her. By the third day, Mercer had mapped several places the girl frequented. All were within walking distance of the abandoned subway station. His instincts told him that was probably Emma's home, a closed, relatively safe place sheltered from the rain. He sat on a bench across the street, pretending to read a newspaper while watching the east entrance of the station. The plywood barriers blocking public access had gaps big enough for a child but not for an adult. On the third hour of his stakeout, his patience paid off. A small figure emerged from a gap in the barriers, glancing cautiously in both directions before darting across the street. It had to be her, blonde hair, clothes far too big for her small frame, moving with quick, quiet steps that made her almost invisible to passers-by. Mercer resisted the urge to approach her immediately. Instead, he decided to observe her routine for a few more days. He discovered that she left every morning, searched specific dumpsters, visited certain spots where kind shopkeepers seemed to know her, and always returned to the station before nightfall. Most fascinating was how she moved through the city, not exactly hiding, but existing in a layer of reality most people simply didn't notice. It was a skill developed out of necessity, and Mercer felt a mix of admiration and sadness as he watched her. On the afternoon of the fourth day, he decided it was time to act. He watched her enter the station around 5 o'clock and waited. 30 minutes later, he approached the same entrance. For him, the small gap between the barriers was too narrow. He circled the building and found a back entrance used by construction workers, secured only by a chain and padlock. For someone with his training, it posed no challenge. In under a minute, Mercer was inside the abandoned station. The place was dark and quiet, with rays of light coming through a few broken windows high above. The air smelled of damp concrete and rusty metal. He moved silently, ears alert for any sound. Then he heard it, a soft clinking sound, like something light being placed on a hard surface. Then another clink, and another. He followed the sound to the old boarding platform. He stopped in the shadows, observing the scene before him. In a relatively clean area lit by a narrow beam of sunlight from a broken window sat Emma. She was completely absorbed in something Mercer couldn't see clearly from where he stood. He quietly shifted to the side for a better view. That's when he saw what she was doing. Bottle caps, dozens of them, arranged in complex patterns on the floor. Blue, red, yellow, green, forming circles, lines, and arrangements that seemed to have meaning only for her. The girl moved the pieces carefully, sometimes whispering words to herself as if narrating a story. Mercer stood there, transfixed. There was something extraordinary in the concentration of that small child organizing her world of colorful caps. It was as though, for a few moments, she wasn't a homeless girl but a queen reigning over her own domain. That was when his foot accidentally kicked a loose piece of concrete, causing it to roll noisily across the floor. The girl's reaction was instantaneous. In a second, she was on her feet, eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, body tense like a startled animal ready to flee. "It's all right," Mercer said, stepping out of the shadows with his hands visible. "I'm not going to hurt you." To his surprise, Emma didn't run. She stood there, watching him intently, her large blue eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. There was no obvious fear in her gaze, just a calculated caution that seemed far too mature for someone so young. Chapter 6. "My name is Daniel," Mercer said, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm looking for someone." "A girl named Emma." She didn't show any reaction at the mention of her name, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I came on behalf of a friend of yours," Mercer continued, crouching slightly to be closer to her height. "A man you helped on a rainy night when there was a fire." Something flickered across the girl's face, recognition, quickly suppressed. "He wants to thank you," Mercer said slowly, pulling out the blue bottle cap from his pocket. "You dropped this that night." Emma looked at the cap, then at Mercer. Her small face remained expressionless, but there was clearly a battle behind those eyes. Trust or flee, believe or doubt. "I don't know any man," she finally said, her voice small and a bit raspy from disuse. Mercer nodded, respecting her caution. "His name is Jackson Hayes. You pulled him out of a burning car. You saved his life." Emma didn't reply. Her gaze dropped to the caps on the floor. Mercer noticed there was an empty spot in the arrangement, exactly the size of the blue cap in his hand. "You have an interesting world here," he commented, looking at the intricate pattern at her feet. "What do they represent?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, but then, surprisingly, she pointed at a group of blue caps. "That's the Northern Kingdom. They have the biggest lake." "Next," she gestured to some green caps. "That's the Forest Kingdom. They make the best weapons." Finally, she indicated the empty space where the blue cap belonged. "That's the Central Castle, where everyone meets to make peace treaties." Mercer felt a tightness in his chest. This child, surviving alone on the streets, had created an entire world where lakes, forests, and peace treaties existed, things her real life probably didn't offer. "It's an impressive kingdom," he said sincerely. "May I put this back in its place?" He offered the blue cap. Emma hesitated, then held out her hand. Her small fingers closed around the cap quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. Carefully, she placed it into the empty spot in her imaginary realm. "Is Jackson Hayes okay?" she asked suddenly, without looking at Mercer. "Yes," he replied. "Thanks to you." "He's rich," she stated. "I saw it on TV." "Yes, he is. Rich people don't care about people like me." The simplicity of her statement and the certainty in it made Mercer's chest tighten again. How many disappointments had this child faced to be so sure of that? "Jackson is different," he said carefully. "He asked me to find you because he wants to thank you in person." "Why?" "I only did what anyone would. But no one else did. Only you." A silence fell between them. Emma seemed to be weighing his words against everything she had lived and learned on the streets. "You work for him?" she finally asked. "Yes. And I'm his friend too." Emma looked back at her caps, gently nudging one with her finger. "Was it you?" Mercer asked, needing direct confirmation. "Were you the one who pulled Jackson from the burning car?" For a long moment, Emma didn't respond. She continued organizing her caps as if she hadn't heard him. Mercer waited patiently. Finally, without raising her eyes from her little kingdom, she spoke. Yes, it was me. I just helped. The simplicity of her reply contained a humility many adults didn't possess. For Emma, saving a life was merely helping, nothing extraordinary, nothing worthy of special recognition. Mercer slowly took his phone out, making sure not to scare her. Can I call him now to tell him I found you? Emma shrugged, a strangely adult gesture in her small body. If you want. Mercer walked a few steps away and dialed. Jackson picked up on the first ring. Daniel, Mercer said simply, I found her. There was silence on the other end, then Jackson's voice, more emotional than Mercer had ever heard it. Is she okay? Where is she? At the abandoned station. She's safe and... Mercer glanced at the small figure on the floor, still immersed in her colorful kingdom. She's extraordinary. I'm on my way, Jackson said, ending the call. Jackson Hayes got out of the car 3 blocks from the abandoned station. He preferred to walk the rest of the way, using those minutes to gather his thoughts. The doctor had protested his early discharge, insisting he needed more observation. But Jackson couldn't wait, not now that Mercer had found Emma. The sky was clear that afternoon, with no hint of the storm that had brought Emma into his life. As he walked, Jackson instinctively touched the bandage on his forehead and felt a slight twinge in his broken ribs, small pains compared to what could have happened. Mercer waited on the corner near the station, his usually impassive face showing subtle concern. How is she? Jackson asked as soon as he got close. Calm. Cautious. Mercer paused. Jackson, you need to understand something. She's survived alone on the streets. She doesn't trust easily, and for good reasons. I understand. No, you don't. Mercer's voice was firm. It's not just about giving her a place to stay or food to eat. She's built an entire world for herself in there, a refuge. We're about to disrupt that. Jackson looked at the station's entrance, thoughtful. What do you suggest? Go slowly. Don't make promises you can't keep. And be absolutely honest. She'll know if you're not. Jackson nodded. He was used to tough negotiations, to boardrooms where billions were at stake, but suddenly he felt completely unprepared to meet a 7-year-old girl. Mercer led him to the back entrance. I'll wait out here, he said, unlocking the chain. She trusts you more than she trusts me. After all, you're the one she saved. Jackson entered the station alone. The contrast between the bright sun outside and the dim interior made him blink a few times. The place smelled of damp concrete and rusted metal. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked down the main corridor. Emma, he called, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. He followed Mercer's directions toward the old platform. As he approached, he noticed a faint beam of light entering through a broken window high above. That's when he saw her. Sitting on the cold concrete, surrounded by colorful bottle caps arranged in complex patterns, was Emma. She seemed even smaller than Jackson remembered from the night of the accident. Her blonde hair was messy, and her clothes, an oversized coat and faded pants, swallowed her thin frame. Jackson stopped a few feet away, not wanting to invade her space. Hello, Emma, he said gently. She lifted her head, and their eyes met. Even in the dim light, Jackson recognized those eyes immediately, large, blue, with an intensity not typical of a child so young. The same eyes that had met his on that stormy night while she pulled him from the flames. You're the man from TV, Emma said, her voice small and slightly hoarse. Yes. My name is Jackson. He took a careful step forward. Your friend Daniel said I could come in. He's not my friend, she corrected quickly. We just talked. Jackson nodded, accepting the distinction. May I sit down? Emma shrugged, a gesture he interpreted as permission. He lowered himself onto the floor, keeping a respectful distance. His ribs complained, but he ignored the pain. For a moment, they were silent. Jackson observed the intricate arrangement of caps in front of him, impressed by its precision. Did you make all this? He asked. Emma nodded, looking at her creation with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. They're the 5 kingdoms, she explained simply. It's amazing, Jackson said, genuinely meaning it. There was something deeply moving about how this child had created an entire world from what others would consider trash. Another silence settled between them. Jackson knew he had to proceed carefully. This wasn't a corporate deal where he could control the situation with well-chosen words or calculated offers. Emma, he finally began, I want to thank you. You saved my life that night. The girl continued looking at her caps. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. Only you. Jackson paused, then asked gently, May I ask you something? Where are your parents? Emma's face grew even more guarded, a shadow passing through her eyes. I don't have a dad, she replied curtly. And your mom. Emma picked up a red cap, turning it over in her fingers before answering. My mom left me. Said she'd be right back. She never came. The plainness of her statement, without pity or drama, hit Jackson like a punch. How many nights had this child waited for someone who never returned? How long until she realized she was completely alone? How long ago? He asked softly. Emma shrugged again. Lots of moons. Jackson understood she probably couldn't measure time accurately. It might have been months or years. And where do you live? Besides here. Different places. Depends on the rain, on the cold. She lifted her eyes to him, a touch of defiance visible. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can, Jackson replied sincerely. You're very smart and brave. Braver than many adults I know. Something in the compliment seemed to catch Emma off guard. Perhaps she wasn't used to being recognized for her abilities, only judged for her circumstances. Jackson glanced around the cold, damp space she called home. A few boxes were stacked in one corner, forming a kind of shelter. A piece of cardboard covered with old fabric served as a bed. Nearby, a torn backpack held what he guessed were all her worldly possessions. Something inside him broke. This child had risked her own safety to save him, and here she was, alone, sleeping on the cold floor of an abandoned station. Emma, he said carefully, you saved my life. And you don't deserve to live like this. The girl looked at him with distrust. She'd likely heard empty promises before. Jackson took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. I have a big house with an empty room. There's hot food, clean water, and a safe place to sleep. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Would you like to come with me? Emma frowned, confused and cautious. Forever. The question caught Jackson off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He was acting on instinct, which was rare for a man who usually calculated every business move. For as long as you want, he answered honestly. If you don't like it, you can leave. I promise. Emma looked at her small kingdom of caps, then at the torn backpack in the corner. Can I bring my things? Of course. Anything you want. She thought for another moment, her young face serious like a judge weighing a complex case. If I don't like it, you'll bring me back here? My word, Jackson promised, surprised by the intensity of his own commitment. Emma got up and began gathering her caps, carefully placing them into a small tin she pulled from the backpack. Then she packed her few belongings. When she finished, she stood in front of Jackson, the battered backpack on her shoulders, looking simultaneously very young and very old. Jackson stood slowly, feeling a twinge in his injured ribs, and held out his hand. Ready? Emma studied his outstretched hand for a long moment, then hesitantly placed her small hand in his. The touch nearly made Jackson falter. Her hand was so tiny, the fingers so delicate, yet at the same time, her grip was firm and determined, a hand that, despite her age, had learned to take care of itself. Together, they walked out of the abandoned station, leaving behind the makeshift shelter Emma had called home. Chapter 7. Mercer was waiting outside, his normally stoic face softening slightly at the sight of the girl holding Jackson's hand. Everything okay? Mercer asked, directing the question mostly to Emma. She nodded, her expression serious as they headed to the car. A light rain began to fall. Jackson noticed Emma glancing worriedly at the sky. Don't worry, he said. We'll be home before the rain gets worse. Home. The word sounded strange even to him. His penthouse had never really felt like a home, more like a place to sleep between business trips and endless meetings. Now, suddenly, he was bringing a child there. In the car, Emma sat quietly, eyes wide as she looked around. Her small hands clutched her backpack on her lap as though someone might try to take her few possessions. Mercer drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the two in the back seat. Jackson could tell his friend was still worried, probably wondering if Jackson truly understood what he was doing. Honestly, he didn't, but he knew it was the right thing. When they arrived at the luxurious building where Jackson lived, Emma looked up in awe at its height. The doorman opened the car door, greeting Jackson with a polite smile, barely concealing his surprise at the sight of a ragged little girl beside him. In the elevator, Emma stayed close to Jackson, her eyes now more cautious. The wealth around her seemed to intimidate her more than life on the streets ever had. "Is this where you live?" she asked when the elevator stopped at the penthouse floor. "Yes. And now you do too, if you like." When they entered the apartment, Christine, Jackson's personal assistant, was waiting. Jackson had called her on the way, giving a brief explanation of the situation. The middle-aged woman, usually focused on spreadsheets and meetings, now looked at Emma with warmth. "Welcome," she said, careful not to get too close. "You two must be hungry." Emma didn't reply, partially hiding behind Jackson. "Why don't we show her around first?" Jackson suggested, sensing the girl's tension. He led her through the spacious apartment, pointing out the living area with its huge windows offering a panoramic view of the city, the modern kitchen he barely used, and his office filled with books. Finally, they reached the guest room. "This can be your room," Jackson said, opening the door. The space was simple yet elegant, decorated in neutral tones with a large bed in the center. For Jackson, it was just a barely used guest room. For Emma, it seemed like a palace. She entered tentatively, looking around as if expecting someone to yell that she didn't belong there. She placed her tattered backpack on the floor by the bed, a stark contrast to the room's decor. Can I sit on the bed?" she asked, her voice small. The question made Jackson's heart clench. "Of course. It's your bed now." Emma approached cautiously, touching the soft comforter with her fingertips as if testing whether it was real. Then slowly she sat on the edge. Her feet dangled, not reaching the floor. "It's soft," she remarked, almost to herself. Christine appeared at the door, carrying some neatly folded clothes and fluffy towels. "I thought you might like a warm bath," she said, placing the items on a nearby chair. "And these clothes should fit until we can buy some others." Emma eyed the clean clothes with a mix of longing and mistrust. "We'll let you get settled," Jackson said. "The bathroom is there." He pointed to a door inside the room. "It has hot water. Use as much as you want." He and Christine left quietly, closing the door behind them. In the hallway, Christine looked at him with an expression that was both surprised and approving. "She really saved your life?" "Yes," Jackson replied simply. "And she has no one?" "No one." Christine nodded, understanding the situation without needing more details. "I'll make something for her to eat." After she left, Jackson paused outside Emma's room before going to his own. He listened to the sound of water running. Something inside him, a part he hadn't known existed, felt like it was thawing. 20 minutes later, Emma emerged. She was unrecognizable. Her blonde hair, now clean, fell in damp waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple t-shirt and pants that, while still a bit large, were clean and intact. Her face, free of dirt, revealed pink cheeks and a light dusting of freckles across her nose. In the kitchen, Christine had prepared a simple meal, hot soup, fresh bread, and some fruit. Jackson watched as Emma sat at the table timidly, her eyes wide at the sight of the food. "Go ahead and eat," he said gently. "There's more if you want it." Emma ate slowly and carefully, as if each spoonful was too precious to waste. Jackson noticed she only finished half the soup before stopping. "Aren't you hungry anymore?" he asked. Emma glanced at the plate, then at Jackson, clearly conflicted. "We can save it for later," Christine said, understanding immediately. "I'll put it in the fridge for you." Relief was visible on Emma's face. Jackson realized she was rationing her food, a habit from never knowing when her next meal would come. Later that evening, as darkness fell over the city, Jackson found Emma sitting on the edge of her bed, looking out the window at the city lights below. She still hadn't gone under the covers, as if unsure whether she was allowed to use the bed. "Time to sleep," he said softly. "It's been a long day." Emma nodded but didn't move. "Is everything okay?" Jackson asked. "It's just so big and soft." Jackson understood. A king-size bed probably felt as foreign to her as sleeping on concrete would feel to him. Do you want me to leave the hallway light on so it's not too dark? Emma nodded, appearing relieved by the suggestion. I'll be in the room down the hall if you need anything. Just call. She looked at him for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of the offer. Thank you, she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. Good night, Emma, Jackson answered, resisting the urge to come closer. He knew instinctively that hugs and goodnight kisses were still far off in the future. He left the door slightly ajar and turned on the hallway light as promised. On his way to his own room, he stopped briefly to speak with Christine, who was getting ready to leave. Do you think I did the right thing? He asked, keeping his voice low so Emma wouldn't hear. Christine, who had known him for years, offered a gentle smile. I think you both needed this, Mr. Hayes. After she left, Jackson stopped by Emma's room before retiring. He peeked through the gap in the door and saw that she had finally slipped under the blankets. She lay in the middle of the huge bed, appearing incredibly small between the white sheets. What surprised him was what he saw next to her on the pillow. Carefully arranged were her colorful caps, organized in the same intricate pattern he'd seen in the station. Her little kingdom, rebuilt in new territory. Jackson smiled to himself. Emma didn't fully trust him yet. Perhaps she never would. But she was trying. She was watching. She was giving this new life a chance. For now, that was enough. Chapter 8. 3 weeks had passed since Emma arrived at Jackson's penthouse. 3 weeks of adjustments, discoveries, and daily small victories. Her world, once limited to alleys and dumpsters, now included her own bedroom, regular meals, and the constant presence of Jackson and Christine. At first, Emma slept on the floor beside the bed, wrapped in a blanket. Jackson found her that way every morning but never commented. He simply smiled and wished her good morning. On the 7th night, she finally slept in the bed, a small step, but significant. Food was also a delicate issue. Emma continued hiding pieces of bread and fruit under her pillow, preparing for days of scarcity her mind still feared. Christine noticed, changed the sheets, washed everything, and never said a word. Gradually, those hidden stashes of food became fewer. On that sunny Saturday morning, Jackson was on the balcony drinking coffee and answering emails. He had drastically reduced his workload in recent weeks, delegating as much as possible to be around Emma. It was a radical change for a man who used to work 16-hour days. Emma appeared silently, as she always did. Despite the comfort of her new home, she still moved like a shadow, a habit hard to break after so long on the streets. Good morning, Jackson said, smiling at her. Did you sleep well? She nodded, sitting in the chair next to him. She was wearing a blue t-shirt and shorts, new clothes Christine had bought her. Her blonde hair, now clean and shiny, was tied in a simple braid Christine had taught her to make. There's orange juice in the fridge, Jackson offered. Want me to get it for you? I'll get it, Emma replied, standing up. Another small victory. During the first weeks, she rarely served herself, as if afraid to take something without permission. Jackson watched as she went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and carefully poured herself some juice. Her movements were still precise, no wasted motion, a leftover survival tactic from the streets. She returned with her glass and sat down again. What do you want to do today? Jackson asked. It's a beautiful day. Emma shrugged, looking at the city skyline below. Anything. It was still difficult for her to express preferences or desires. Jackson was learning to recognize the small signs, the way her eyes lit up at certain things, how she relaxed a bit in certain settings. We could visit the aquarium, he suggested. Or Central Park. There's a lake there with ducks. Something changed in her expression, a subtle spark. Ducks. Yes. We can bring bread to feed them if you like. Emma nodded, trying to hide her excitement, but Jackson noticed. He was learning to read her subtle expressions, her silent language developed for survival. As they finished breakfast, Christine arrived with some documents Jackson needed to sign. The assistant had naturally taken on a maternal role for Emma, teaching her how to braid her hair, pick out clothes, and do small household tasks. Good morning, sunshine, Christine said, using the nickname she'd given Emma. The girl didn't smile, but her eyes softened, her equivalent of a warm greeting. Christine placed the papers on the table, along with a drawing pad and a box of colored pencils. "I thought you might like these," she said casually, as if it were no big deal. Emma eyed the supplies curiously but didn't touch them right away. Jackson saw her hesitation. She was still wary of gifts, as if they might vanish at any moment. "Go ahead, give it a try," he encouraged gently, sliding the drawing pad toward her. "Christine told me you made a beautiful sketch yesterday." The day before, while Jackson was in a video conference, Christine had given Emma some pencils and paper. The girl had drawn a series of colorful circles that she later explained represented her bottle cap kingdoms. Emma finally picked up a blue pencil and began scribbling on the pad. Jackson and Christine exchanged quick looks of approval, then focused on the documents they needed to review. For nearly an hour, they worked in silence while Emma drew. Occasionally, Jackson glanced at her, noting her intense concentration, the tip of her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she worked. When they finished reviewing the documents, Christine said her goodbyes, promising to return the next day. "Have fun at the park," she added, smiling at Emma. Jackson put the papers away and looked at Emma, who was still drawing. "May I see what you're making?" She hesitated, then moved the pad slightly to reveal her creation. However, she hadn't drawn on the pad, she'd used a paper napkin on the table. Jackson was surprised. The drawing was simple, with childlike lines, but extremely expressive. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands in front of what looked like a house with a triangular roof and a chimney releasing smoke. A bright yellow sun shone in the upper corner, and colorful flowers dotted the yard. It was Jackson and Emma. A house. A family. Something tightened in Jackson's chest. He tried to speak but found the words wouldn't come easily. It's lovely, Emma," he finally said. She regarded the drawing critically. "The roof is crooked." "No, it's perfect." Jackson lightly touched the napkin. "Did you ever have a house like that? A place of your own?" Emma shook her head. "Only in my head." 3 simple words containing a world of loss and longing. Jackson felt his heart ache again. What was it like to grow up without a place to call your own? No security, no warm bed, no one waiting for you at the end of the day? Jackson picked up the napkin carefully, stood, and left the balcony without explaining. Emma watched him go with a neutral expression, but her eyes followed him intently. In his office, Jackson opened a drawer and took out an old leather planner. Between its pages, he kept photographs and important documents. Gently, he placed Emma's napkin drawing between the pages, smoothing it so it wouldn't crumple. When he returned to the balcony, Emma was still seated, sipping her juice, seemingly indifferent. But Jackson noticed how her eyes darted to his empty hands, noting that he hadn't thrown away her drawing. He said nothing about the napkin. He didn't mention that he'd placed it among his most valuable possessions or how deeply it had touched him. Instead, he smiled and said, "Shall we get ready to see the ducks?" Their day at the park was calm and pleasant. Emma was fascinated by the ducks, though she kept a serious expression as she fed them. Jackson observed how she made sure to distribute the bread evenly, including to the smaller ducks that lagged behind. Afterward, they walked around, pausing to watch a group of kids playing ball. Emma watched them with a mix of curiosity and caution. When one of the children waved, inviting her to join, she hid partially behind Jackson. "You don't have to play if you don't want to," he said gently. "I don't know how," she replied, eyes still on the kids. "I could teach you another time if you want." She nodded, and they kept walking. Jackson noticed how she looked at other families, parents and children holding hands, piggyback rides, laughter, a world she had only observed from the outside, like looking through a storefront window. On the way home, they stopped at an ice cream shop. Emma chose chocolate but ate only half before asking to save the rest. "We can always come back and get more," Jackson explained gently. "I still want to save it," she insisted. Jackson understood. Old habits were hard to break. For Emma, conserving resources was a deeply ingrained survival instinct. That evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room watching a documentary about marine animals. Emma was captivated by the colorful images of tropical fish and coral reefs. Jackson made occasional comments, explaining interesting facts about the creatures. When the program ended, it was time for Emma to go to bed. This part of the routine was already well established: a bath, brushing teeth, clean pajamas, and a story read by Jackson before sleep. As he tucked her in, Emma looked thoughtful, her large eyes fixed on the ceiling. "What is it?" Jackson asked. "Is something bothering you?" Emma was quiet for a moment, as though gathering courage. "Do you have a family?" she asked finally. The question took Jackson by surprise. In all the weeks Emma had lived with him, they'd never really talked about his past. "My parents died a long time ago," he answered honestly. "I have no siblings." "But you're rich," Emma said, frowning. "In stories, rich people always have families." Jackson smiled at the childlike logic. "Real life is sometimes different from stories." "You never had kids?" "No." Jackson paused, wondering how much to share. He decided on honesty. Emma deserved it. "I guess I was too busy building companies, making money. I never stopped to build a family." Emma took this in, her face serious as she processed it. "So you're alone." It wasn't a question but a statement, and its simplicity hit Jackson deeply. "Yes," he agreed softly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But if you want, we can be family. You and me." Emma's eyes widened, shining in the dimly lit room. For a moment, Jackson worried he'd gone too far, too quickly. Perhaps she wasn't ready for such a commitment. Then Emma did something she had never done before. She sat up in bed and hugged him, her thin arms wrapped tightly around his neck with surprising strength, as though she feared he might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "No one's ever wanted me before." Jackson felt overwhelming emotion rising in his throat. Gently, he hugged her back, conscious of her fragile little body in his arms. He wanted to say so many things, that she was special, that she deserved love, that he would protect her always, but words felt inadequate. So he simply held her, letting the embrace convey what words could not. When she finally pulled away, there was suspicious moisture in both their eyes. "I think I'll like having a family," Emma said, her voice small but determined. "Me too," Jackson replied, adjusting the blanket around her. "Me too." He turned off the light, leaving only a small lamp on, just how Emma preferred. At the door, he turned to look at her once more. The girl was already lying down, her eyes closing as the day's fatigue caught up with her. On the nightstand beside the bed, Jackson noticed she'd arranged her colorful caps in a new pattern, a perfect circle, like a sun, or maybe a family. He closed the door softly and headed to his office. There, he opened the drawer and took out the planner where he'd stored Emma's drawing. He gazed at the two stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a crooked roof and smoking chimney. That napkin contained more than a simple child's drawing. It was a wish, a dream, a hope. And it was a promise Jackson intended to keep. The end. If you enjoyed the story, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more updates.